While the world remembers the tragedy of the Holocaust, few know of the millions of Poles who were brutally uprooted, exiled, and forgotten by history. These are their stories, the stories of the stolen lives of Polish deportees. Imagine waking up one day, hearing a knock on your door, and within hours, your entire family is loaded onto cattle trucks, with no idea where you're going. This was the reality for over 1.7 million Poles during World War II, not because they were Jewish, but because they were seen as a threat by the Soviet Union. These weren't resistance fighters or criminals. Many of them were the country's educated elites, teachers, civil servants, landowners. Their only crime was their profession or social status, and for this they were deemed enemies of the state by Stalin's regime and exiled to the cold wastelands of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other distant parts of Russia. Though the Holocaust rightly remains a central memory of World War II's horrors, there's another tragic story that is often overlooked. Polish citizens, who were rounded up by Stalin's regime and deported to labor camps in remote regions, stripped of their homes, communities, and identities. After the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, the Soviet Union annexed over 201,000 square kilometers of Polish territory, home to more than 13 million people. Stalin wanted complete control of the region and saw anyone who could resist as a threat. In a series of 4 waves of deportations between 1940 and 1941, entire Polish families, including children, women, and the elderly, were forcibly sent to labor camps, also known as Gulags, in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. Most were taken to Siberia, becoming known as the Siberaki, but thousands of others faced similar, if not worse, conditions in Kazakhstan and other parts of Soviet Russia. Families were often taken in the dead of night, with little more than the clothes on their backs, and packed into cattle trucks, bound for the most inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union. Imagine being forced to leave your home, your entire world, and traveling into the unknown, where every day became a fight to survive, not knowing if you'd ever return. Their new homes? Frozen labor camps or isolated settlements where survival became a daily struggle. The Siberaki, and the many other Polish deportees sent to Kazakhstan and distant parts of Russia, faced unimaginable hardships. They were not sent to labor camps for being criminals or rebels, but because they represented an educated, influential class. For the Soviet regime, this was about erasing Polish culture and ensuring there would be no leaders left to inspire an uprising. These deportees lost homes, communities, and many lost family members to hunger, disease, and cold. They lived in remote settlements, working as laborers just to survive, while their children faced the loss of their childhoods. Entire families, including children, the elderly, and women, were forced to work alongside the men. The conditions in the labor camps were brutal, with temperatures often plunging below -30 degrees Celsius. The work included grueling tasks like cutting down trees in sub-zero temperatures, often with inadequate clothing, tools, and food. Despite the cold biting at their skin and exhaustion weighing down their bodies, they had to keep working. Those who failed to meet their daily quotas faced severe punishments. The consequences for not working hard enough were extreme. Food rations were cut, leaving deportees with barely enough to survive. Some were thrown into solitary confinement in freezing cells, often with no proper clothing or blankets, left to endure the bitter cold alone. Beatings were common for those seen as slacking, with guards using rifle butts or fists to enforce control. Workers who didn't meet their quotas could be forced to work longer hours, sometimes up to 16 or 18 hours a day, pushing their bodies beyond the point of exhaustion. In the worst cases, deportees would have their clothing and blankets confiscated, leaving them exposed to the unforgiving cold. With temperatures often dropping to dangerous levels, this could quickly lead to frostbite or even death. For those who did survive, the scars were permanent, both physical and emotional. These labor camps were not just about extracting work, they were designed to wear down the deportees through brutal conditions, with little regard for their well-being or survival. But a glimmer of hope emerged in 1942 when General Wladyslaw Anders, leader of the Polish army in exile, managed to negotiate the evacuation of Polish soldiers and civilians from the Soviet Union, following the signing of the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement. This agreement resulted in a one-time amnesty for Polish citizens, allowing them to form the Anders army. In less than 1 month, under Anders' orders, more than 33,000 soldiers and more than 10,000 civilians, including thousands of children, left the Soviet Union for Iran via the Caspian Sea. Though a significant effort, this was only a small fraction of the 1.7 million Poles who had been deported by the Soviets. The majority were sadly forced to stay behind. After the first evacuation, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile grew. On August 9, 1942, a second wave of evacuations began. By the time it ended in September, more than 69,000 people had escaped, including thousands of civilians and children. In total, more than 115,000 Poles were evacuated during these operations, thanks to General Anders, and they were scattered across Iran and eventually to countries like Mexico, India, New Zealand, South Africa, Uganda, and Tanganyika. For many of these families, this was not just the beginning of their journey to safety, it was the beginning of years of separation. Men and boys were taken to fight with General Anders' army, while women and children were relocated to distant countries. Separated from their loved ones, those who remained faced unbearable hardships on their journey. Wanda Ellis, one of the evacuees, recalled the horrors of the journey. The hunger was terrible. Each slice of bread had to be stolen or gotten in any other way. It was a hell. Hungry, sick people, children in rail cars, filled with lice, illnesses, typhoid, dysentery, no restrooms in cars. To relieve ourselves, we had to jump out of the train whenever it stopped. It is a miracle that we survived, with thousands dead. For many, this journey to safety also meant separation from their loved ones for years. Men and boys went on to fight alongside General Anders, while women and children were relocated to distant countries. Families were scattered across the globe, and for years they had no way of knowing if they would ever reunite. Many families were eventually reunited after the war, thanks to the efforts of organizations like the Red Cross, which ran programs such as Restoring Family Links. The heartbreak of separation was only healed through reunions, some happening decades later, as families reconnected through the tireless work of the Red Cross. Sadly, many families were never reunited, their loved ones lost to the brutal conditions and the passage of time. From Iran, these survivors were scattered across various countries, thanks to agreements with Mexico, India, New Zealand, South Africa, Uganda, and Tanganyika. India took in 5,000 Polish orphans. Mexico offered sanctuary to 10,000 refugees. New Zealand accepted over 700 children, and South Africa welcomed 500 Polish children. Uganda and Tanganyika also took in Polish refugees as part of the larger relocation efforts in Africa. The journey by warships was perilous, with dangerous sea routes and the constant threat of bombing as the war raged on. Tragically, some of these ships never made it to their destinations, not just due to treacherous sea conditions, but because some ships were bombed as World War II was still in full force around them. These deportees, having already endured so much, faced the relentless dangers of war even in their final push for safety. Yet, for every family that managed to escape, many more never made it out. It's estimated that only around 115,000 Poles successfully left the Soviet Union during these evacuations. The rest remained in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other remote parts of Russia, and for them, survival was not guaranteed. By the end of the war, 150,000 Poles who remained in the Soviet Union had perished before the war ended, leaving only memories of the communities they had lost. The story of the Polish deportees, those sent to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and beyond, is one of endurance and loss. For those who survived, the emotional and physical scars of their time in labor camps ran deep and never fully healed. Even today, the survivors of these deportations and their descendants carry the weight of these stolen years, reminding us of the human cost of political repression. This tragedy remains lesser known in much of the world, but for Poland, the memory of these deportees is a part of the nation's history. Their story is not just about survival in Siberia and Kazakhstan. It is about the resilience of a people who were ripped from their homeland, forced into exile, and left to battle the harshest of conditions. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and told to generations to come. These are stories of humanity that the world needs to hear. Let us share them. Let us ensure that the stories of these forgotten Poles are never erased from the memory of history. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, share this video now. Help us spread the word, tell their story, share their legacy. The world needs to know. Never forget the horrors of war. Subscribe for free for more true stories from real history.